background of why we're talking about it, why we think it makes a difference, what the underlying physiology is of adolescent sleep, how that relates to kind of education and health for our teens, and why we think it really does make a difference. The second portion of this, I'll hand it over to Jessica, who will talk about how you can actually implement it, and she'll go through her examples of how Princeton, the issues that Princeton went through, how they solved it. And then what we'll get to at the end is what we're really, the advocacy portion of it. And the goal of this is really to help educate people throughout the state and beyond that this is important, and help you make those first steps, because as we'll talk about, this is likely going to be something that is done on a grassroots level, town by town. So let's start. We'll give some background information. So anytime you're going to talk about change, it's always important to understand why it is where it is. So let's just start with the basics. Early school start times, almost every single district were started to solve one problem, a transportation problem. It was either an economic decision or a logistical issue in terms of buses, or both, but it was not based on education. So schools did not always start early. 50s and 60s and earlier than that, school start times were at 8:30 or 9. The parents of our current high school children likely went to high school in the 80s to early 2000s, and it was during that time that these high school start times got moved earlier. What happened was, when you had one town with a school start time at 8:30 or 9, you had more students. That means that you needed more busing, you had less bus drivers, and so the solution was run a second route. And then the town got bigger, and then you had to run a third route. So in a lot of communities right now, you'll see 3 routes being run with 3 school start times, and the decision was made to have the adolescents go early. What's important is that there was never a decision that there was an educational or health benefit to having high school students start early, nor was there ever a decision that we should do this so we could end the day early. There were positive, things that came out of starting early, like all the operational issues when you end school early, but that was not the driving force. So as we start to think through, can we change this? It's important to understand that the driving initial problem that we have to solve was transportation. The second thing we have to keep in mind are adolescent development. And so we talk about this a lot in terms of, as we talk about legalizing marijuana, where we say adolescents are not young adults, though they might look like it, at times they might act like it. Their brains are still developing through the age of 25, and that this period of time is actually a critical time period where they are having this exponential brain growth, second to only after infancy. So it is really important that we protect their brains at this point. We also know that adolescents make really impulsive decisions in some specific settings. So when they are tired, they make bad decisions. When they are around their friends, they make bad decisions. And when they are unsupervised, they make bad decisions. So if you can imagine setting up a school day such that the adolescents are tired and get out of school early, unsupervised, around their friends, while they're exhausted, is a setup where they're making bad decisions. And so we'll talk about how that impacts substance abuse a little bit later. And then the last fact is that we know that mental health issues in adolescence have been on the rise. So the data is here. We don't have time in this particular talk to go through it, but from, nationally, we saw from 08 to 17, we've seen ER and hospital data doubling. Locally, as I've looked, when we look at 2008 through 2018 in our own local ER, the patients coming in for mental health issues to the emergency room over tripled during that 10-year period. Which is not to say that our school start times are causing this. It is to say that there is a crisis at hand, and we have to look for any possible solution, and this is one of them. All right, so let's get into sleep. All of this is predicated on the notion of our adolescents are not getting enough sleep, and it's that sleep that is negatively impacting, the lack of sleep that is negatively impacting them. So there's evidence to talk about sleep being critical. It's amazing that we have to say it. I think we as a society, for a period of time, lost our focus on how important sleep is. We know that this is when the brain processes information. We know that adolescents need a lot of sleep. So you see it, like you remember being an adolescent. In general, the CDC says 8 to 10 hours, but it's probably 8.5 to 9.25 hours. And there is a tipping point, 8 hours or more. When we start to get under 8 hours of sleep, it really seems to really negatively impact the adolescents. And Jess will probably comment on this, but data from anytime schools survey their data, they typically get this consistent response, 6 to 7 hours of sleep, and sometimes as little as 5 hours. All right, what does that mean in terms of evidence for sleep actually negatively impacting the adolescents? So one, it impacts learning. There'll be resources at the end of this. At this point, I'm just going to quickly go through these facts, and you have to trust me on this. There's tons of studies. A study that came out of Rutgers last year looks at how learning is impacted by chronic sleep loss. That Rutgers study took kids where they broke them into two groups, sleep 5 hours and sleep 9 hours. At the end of 5 days of those two paths, they then gave them information, and then they tested them immediately and then over time. And what do you think happened? The people who had chronic sleep deprivation, who slept only 5 hours a night, had much poorer retention. So if we're talking about learning being the goal of school, ensuring that they're sleeping is important. Mental health issues. There are studies that show that both not have chronic sleep loss increases the risk of anxiety and depression. And if you have mental health issues, having chronic sleep loss exacerbates any underlying mental health issue you have. And then there's studies about safety. So automobile accidents. Fairfax, Virginia, they as a county changed their school start times. Study came out this past year, and it looked at automobile accidents in the 2 years before they changed the school start times into the 2 years afterwards, and compared that to the rest of Virginia. 2 less automobile accidents per 1,000 adolescents in that 2-year time period. Increasing the risk of medical problems. So heart disease, we're often talking about an hour, and sometimes we'll hear people say, how much difference does an hour make? Studies ER data, if you look at springing forward, so when we do daylight savings time and we lose an hour of sleep, increase in heart attacks in ERs increased 24%. When you wind that back and you're falling back in the fall and you gain an hour of sleep, if you look at that next 24-hour period in ERs, there was a 21% decrease in heart attacks. That's just based on an hour in that the 24-hour period after changing times. And then growth suppression. If we look at impulsive behaviors, substance abuse, and sexual risk-taking, there's studies that show specifically adolescents who have less sleep are more prone to more sexual risk-taking. And then increasing sports injuries, and we'll talk about sports in a second. Now, flip it around. So we're saying not sleeping has all these negative impacts. What about increased sleep? So there is a ton of evidence that if you do the opposite, if you allow them to sleep more, you actually see the positive effects. So you see improved attendance, you see improved grade, moods, and sports performance. So there are studies that show that sleeping more is actually protective against injuries and is actually performance enhancing. So, the Washington Nationals had a sleep physician who they gave a World Series ring to because they believe that maximizing sleep, again, is performance enhancing. And then we see a decrease in all of the negative things that we want to see: tardiness, absenteeism, mental health issues. All right, so they should go to sleep more, right? That's the answer. Why don't they just tell them to go to sleep early? Because that's how we would solve all this problem. There's a lot of reasons why they don't go to sleep early, right? So there's, at the end of the night, there's a bunch of variables. Some of this is under controls of the school. Some of this is under control of the parents. Some of this is us as a society, homework, activities, social media. We can all work on better sleep hygiene. So we talk about this often in the office. You want to have a consistent bedtime. Your room should really be for sleeping. You want to limit electronics or social media before bed. You want to have, and so you want to do all of those things. But if you do all of those things, you cannot get the kids to go to sleep at 9 o'clock. How come? Because there's this normal physiologic change in circadian rhythms. And so we're going to spend a slide on this. And this is the science that you have to understand to believe that we have to shift times to kind of match the adolescent needs, because they're physiologically not able to go to sleep. They have this shift in their sleep and wake schedules because of this melatonin release that we'll talk about. And this ultimately means that these kids are not tired before 10:30 or 11. You remember it from being an adolescent. If you have adolescents in the house, you almost always see it. And we're seeing it right now as we're leaving them to their own devices. They want to go to sleep as late as possible. Yet there's only one reason why they wake up early, and that's because we make them, right? Because of school start time. So in lots of places right now, people are seeing that their kids are not waking up. When we make them wake up at 5:30 in the morning because school's starting at 7:20, they're not getting enough sleep. So let's go into this so you can understand what this means with circadian rhythms. Melatonin, people hear about this hormone. You can get melatonin over the counter. It's a hormone that's released by the pineal gland in the brain. And the goal of it is to help you get tired. So we generally believe that there is two processes that combine together to make you go to sleep. You have to have an increasing sleep load, so the day has gone on and you're getting more and more tired, and you need to have your circadian rhythms telling you it's time to shut down. Melatonin is what helps you do that and maintain sleep. And this melatonin we find in all animals, and it helps with reproduction cycles and breeding. So potentially that's why there is this shift in teenagers. But what we do know is that in teenagers, this melatonin doesn't start to get released till later, 10:30 or 11, which is why these kids are not tired at 9:30. And it continues well past sunrise. So the last time you tried to shake your teen and try to get them up, their body is trying to stay asleep. And Mythbuster, this is not new. It is not Steve Jobs' fault. iPhones didn't do this. This happens worldwide, and it has always occurred. It happened to you as you were a kid. And why doesn't it happen now to you as an adult? Because your circadian rhythms in your 20s shift back into the pattern that you're used to, if not into a little bit of an earlier pattern where you're able to wake up a little earlier. And the result is that, girls and boys, typically 2 to 3 hours is, they're shifting from what you remember when they were 9 or 10, as they're going into 13, 14, 15, they are on a later schedule. So typically, if you just had to ballpark it, most kids can start to fall asleep around 11, and they want to wake up around 8. So let's get to what this means. For schools that are starting at 7:20, students can wake up at 5:30 in the morning, give themselves a little bit of time to get ready, or they can get up at 6:30 or 6:45. You drag them out of bed, they don't brush their teeth, you rush them into the car, you give them some protein bar, and then we expect them to make it through the day. If they got up at 5:30 or 6 and they tried to give themselves a little bit of time and they couldn't fall asleep till 10:30 or 11, there you go. You can't get more than 6 or 7 hours. The math doesn't allow you. And we already said they need 8 hours plus. Not only that, it's not just the quantity of sleep. Remember, 5:36 to them feels like 3:30 in the morning to us, right? There's a 2-hour shift. So remember those days where you wake up and that alarm clock gets you up at the wrong kind of point in your sleep cycle. You just feel like you're not up all day long. That's what it's like to these kids when we're waking them up. It feels to them like it's 3 o'clock in the morning. And they do not get used to it. So people generally do not get used to these changes in schedule. If you ask people who do shift work, if you ask people who work on radio stations, they generally never feel great. Their bodies are just not physiologically meant to get up at the time that they're waking up. So what should it look like? What do you think? 45 minutes to get ready? So if you give yourself 45 minutes to get ready, transportation typically takes 45 minutes. So make that an hour and a half. Maybe there's some time to walk to the bus. The net result is from getting out of bed to showing up at school, you probably need 90 to 120 minutes, which if we say you can't fall asleep till 10:30 or 11, and we want you to get a minimum of 8 hours sleep, ideally more, you're not waking up till 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the morning. If you're waking up at 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the morning, this is where the derivations come for school start times. So where they have to be 8:30, at ideally 8:30, if not later, to kind of coordinate with the kids feeling like they could get up, get ready, and be ready to start their day. So this is not just us saying this. There's policy statements about this. So first off, there is no one who is against this. So there is no organized body who thinks that this is a bad idea. The American Academy of Pediatrics came out in 2014 with their school start time for adolescents, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, the CDC, county health rankings and roadmaps. Along with this, California, and I'll show you the slide in a second, California changed their law. So as of, I believe it'll be 2022, statewide, they have to do this. In October of 2019, Pennsylvania convened a bipartisan commission to look at this, and they came out with a policy statement that we have resources at the end. And they, again, reiterated that this is the right science. Is there evidence that delaying school start time works? Multiple. So again, other mythbusters. So now that people have been talking about this since the 90s, there are multiple studies. Seattle did this one with Fitbits pre and post change that showed that this actually works, and Jessica will get into this, but there's studies showing all the benefits of things I talked about before. There's a ton of evidence that shows that when you delay the school start times, the kids just sleep more. So another mythbuster is what people will say is they'll just stay up later. They don't stay up later if we do our job and reinforce that it's important to go to bed. So in general, the studies show that for 30, you get a half a minute to a minute for every minute that you delay school start times. It's not only the students. There's studies that came out of Denver that showed that teachers are happier with it. Everyone sleeps better. They feel better. Their students are more awake. So what are schools doing nationally? In general, we're still not doing great. Most schools, this is as of 2015, but there hasn't been a ton of movement yet. More and more cities are doing this, districts are doing this, but locally, as I'm here in Central Jersey, you can see, some of the majority of high schools are starting early. Princeton is the positive outlier. And here we'll take a moment and we'll pause just for a second. If you could tell us, what time do schools start in your district? You can see the polls there, and we'll just try to take 30 seconds to do this. All right, so let's see. Wow, there's half the schools, at least here, said 8 to 8:30, which is great. Oh, those are for middle school, sorry. Let's see, high schools. What is that? 80% of people who are reporting about their high schools, and those numbers look like 250 different respondents between 7 and 8 o'clock. So not surprising. All right, so I'm going to end in this, and Jessica, I'm nailing my 20 minutes, so I stayed on time. But California in 2018, they passed a law. It actually got vetoed by Governor Brown, but then Senator Portantino, along with the California PTA, kind of reinvigorated people, and the law got passed last year, which is great. And I just wanted people to read this quote: establishing a time before which schools should not begin mandated instruction is as fundamental as requiring to turn on the heat when the temperature falls below a certain level. Local districts would set their own hours. They need only meet the minimum no earlier than start time that's proven to be essential to students' well-being. It's time for an evidence-based, sound policy discussion that prioritizes student health and achievement. And here's the sentence: teaching adolescents at a time that they cannot effectively learn is an ineffective use of public funds and undermines our children's health and their chance for success today and in the future. So on that note, almost everyone that I've given this talk to always says, that's great, I totally buy into it. It sounds awesome. It's just impossible. There are so many forces against it. We cannot do it. It's pie in the sky. And that is where I turn to my friend and colleague, Jessica, who will now show us how they did it. So Jess, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jessica Baxter. I am the principal at Princeton High School. Before this, I was the assistant principal at the school. So I've been there for quite a few years. Above all, I'm an advocate for students because as a principal and as an educator, the health and safety of students is my number one priority. I saw that there's quite a few school nurses on here. So in addition to saying Happy Nurses Week, I also want to, I'm glad you're here because I know my school nurses are advocates for our students as well. And hopefully you can take what you learn here and go back to your districts and, and start working on implementing later start times for schools. So let me begin. Okay, so the why in our journey. So we are in our second year of a later start time. In Princeton, it is 8:20 when we start the high school. But really the story starts back in the 2015-2016 school year. We were noticing a lot with our students. They were stressed out, they were overscheduled. They had high number of absences and tardies to school and to class. We had a lot of serious mental health issues. We were sending out a lot of students to the local hospital for mental health evaluations, as Bert was mentioning. The number since 2008 has tripled, the number of these students going to the ER for evaluations. At that time, about 20% of our students had 504s for anxiety. We were seeing a lot was going on. The high school was a pressure cooker. So we started saying, how can we gather more information about what's going on with our students? So the following school year in 2016-17, we partnered with Challenge Success, which is out of Stanford University. And really they look at student engagement and the high school experience of our kids. So we utilized them and their survey tool to capture data to see what was going on. So in December of 2016, we surveyed our students and we had about a 91% participation rate. And what we found was not surprising, but it is startling when you look at it. Really, the results were just a confirmation of what we knew, but seeing it in numbers, it really was a call for action to us and we knew we needed to do something. So our kids were getting fewer than 6.5 hours of sleep a night when they should have been getting closer to 9. Remember, these are 14-year-olds all the way up to 18-year-olds. So 14-year-olds are pretty young, and our freshmen were pretty much reporting what our seniors were reporting, which was about 6.5 hours of sleep, which is clearly not enough. They were also, a lot of our students were missing a number of days a year, and they were being classified as chronically absent, which means they're missing more than 18 days of school a year. So quite a large number of students were missing at least 1 day a month due to stress. We had high numbers of tardies to school. There was also a homework issue, which might have contributed to why students were getting so few hours of sleep a night. They were reporting about 3 to 3.5 hours of homework a night. Also, it was lack of engagement. They were doing school. Our students do well academically. If you look at numbers, they're going to go to class, they're going to take the AP courses, they're going to get A's, they're going to score well on SATs, AP exams, but they were not truly engaged in school. So during that school year, we really wanted to look at that and see what could we do? How could we do better as a school? This is just some of the data on homework. And if you notice right across the board, 9th grade all the way up through 12th grade was reporting similar numbers. So you have 14-year-olds with similar homework loads to juniors and seniors, which is not something we would want. And it was contributing to them staying up late. Our kids really, if you think about this, if they're getting up early because our prior start time was 7:50 in the morning. So they're getting up at 6 in the morning and they're pretty much on from 6 in the morning all the way through till about 11 or 12 at night. So sleep was really being sacrificed for them being overscheduled and overworked. And I really think the start time is something that you can do to address some of these issues. All right, before I go on to this, I just want to say, when we started this work with Challenge Success, I do believe there are 3 pieces to this. I think there are things the school needs to do. I think there are things that the parents need to do, and I think there are things the students need to do. So everyone has a piece in this. And I think start times are on the school, and start times and homework and workload. Students and parents also need to work on prioritizing sleep and really making sure that students aren't overscheduled in and out of school. And we can go more into that, but I just want to show you, we gave the survey in 2018 and then again in 2019 after we implemented the start time. So we went to a half-hour later start time, and you can see right from here, students are reporting about a half-hour more of sleep. So if the reason, I hear a lot of people say, if you change your start time, that just means kids are going to go to sleep later. What it means is kids are going to get more sleep. And that's the bottom line. There's more work to do in other areas, I believe, definitely on sleep hygiene. But we changed our start time by a half hour, and then we surveyed our students after a year of doing it, and they are reporting a half hour more of sleep. And when you look at the numbers here, we shouldn't pat ourselves on the back too much. They're reporting a half hour more of sleep, but they're still well under the recommended 9 hours of sleep for their age group. So that is still a cause for concern. And I still think it's an issue that we need to work to address in other areas. This slide also just talks about, this is from an earlier survey we did in 2017. And this is the students who experienced physical health problems in the past month because of stress. And stress is causing difficulty sleeping, which is also contributing to them not getting enough sleep. And I do want to state, these are numbers from Princeton High School when we surveyed our students, but we are right on par with high schools across the United States that also took the Challenge Success Survey. So this was not necessarily a Princeton problem. This is a problem with our adolescents across the United States. Our students are not getting enough sleep. They're overscheduled, they're overworked, and it is a community, it's a family, and it's a school issue that we all need to work together to solve. Okay. Another part of the survey is student voice. We asked them about possible school changes and if they think they would be effective. And from here, what you can see is highlighted. Before we changed the start time, when we surveyed them, we asked them, if we change the start time of the school day to later, would it be an effective school change? And 63% of our kids thought it would be. And there are other areas in here too, and I just want to point out, I know we're talking about start time, but I also look to alleviate overall stress. We also asked them other areas that they would like. We did lengthen our lunch break. We did put in more unstructured time in the day, more time for them to work on assignments in school so they're not spending so much time in the evening staying up late working on homework. Kids thought these changes would be helpful. So it's really important in this whole process to collect student voice as well. So I'll go right here to the process because I think a lot of you are saying, but how do you do this? The biggest hurdles are transportation and sports and sometimes teaching contracts. So I'll let you know about our process now. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. We shared our data from our survey in the spring of 2016, and we had a parent forum, and I'll never forget it. As we showed this data to parents, they were angry. And they were angry at us as a school for doing this to their kids, for stressing them out. And they're right. We did do part of this to them. But I still hold true to, we are all in this together and we can solve this problem together. So what we did was we began a bell schedule committee to look at how we could change our schedule to maybe address things like workload and homework and stress. And we really started this nice, good discussion in the spring of 2016. It took a good year and a half of committee work before we implemented any changes because our changes did not take place until the 2018-19 school year. And I think when you look at the process, the first thing is to gather people. And I don't like to use the word stakeholders, but that's what you need. You need parents on the committee, you need administrators, you need teachers, and you need kids, and you need to capture everyone's voice. Another important part to the process is as you're meeting, and you need to meet often because this needs to be a priority committee. You need to be sharing information. So we had people from each department in our high school who were they would gather information from the department, bring it to committee. We would discuss things. They would bring it back to them, get feedback. So throughout the year and a half we worked on this, people were well informed. So this was never a surprise to anybody that it was a priority and that it was something we were working on. we reviewed a lot of research, and the research on adolescent sleep cycles is pretty clear cut. And as Bert said, um, kids are teenagers with their circadian rhythms. They're supposed to be going to bed around 11, whereas for someone like me, I can't. That's too late. It's not true for kids that age. So we use data, we use research to inform our decisions. And most of all, we talked about what we wanted for our students and what we wanted for ourselves as educators as far as instruction. And I think our goal is to have good instruction and healthy kids, because we know this leads to academic achievement and overall well-being. So I think first thing in any process is gather people, but also lead with your values and stick to them throughout the process. After about a year and a half of meeting, and the superintendent was informed of this, the board knew that this was going on, and they did receive periodic updates, but we did have a list of recommendations from this committee. The biggest one, of course, is, and what we're here for, is the later start time. We didn't say what the later start time would be, although we did lead with the fact that the research does state it should be 8:30 or later. We landed on 8:20, and I'll get to that in a few minutes why. But we asked for a later start time. And I'm only going to mention the next few because I think it will address some questions with sports and transportation. We do have rotating periods. Our morning periods rotate, and so do our afternoon. We have different cycle days, and we have shorter period days and block days with unstructured periods at the end of them. We also held true to, if we are going to go to a later start time, that means nothing happens before school. That means no zero period. That means no before school sports practices. Because that just fills up the time and it doesn't change anything. If you're saying you truly value sleep, and we understand that adolescents need to sleep later, which is why we're moving the start time, we preserve that before school period. And that's been working pretty well. So the obstacles are sports. And I will say this, if that's your biggest obstacle, I don't think that's enough. And I also will say a lot of surrounding schools in our conference were not happy when they heard we were going to a later start time, because we already started later than most schools in our conference. So they usually had to wait for us for games to begin. But prior to a later start time, our students were already being dismissed early from school. And because our schedule didn't rotate, they were missing the same period, the last period of the day. So students and coaches were missing that day to leave early for sports. So the way we worked it in with our later start time is, because periods rotate, if kids need to be dismissed early, they don't miss the same class every time. Also, we have 2 days where there's unstructured time at the end of the day for kids to meet with teachers, so they're not missing a class. Transportation is a big issue, but we have a phenomenal transportation director who is a yes person, and she's a problem solver, and she and the superintendent work very closely on start times, and that's how we landed at 8:20. We coupled our middle school and high schoolers, so they now ride the bus together, which works for us because the schools are directly across the street from each other and have similar start times. Because I want to let you know that even though the high school changed start times, the other schools in the district did not, it leads to a later problem, which I'll discuss. So transportation actually worked out for us. We do have a sending district, and it did cost them more money, so they had a budget for that, but they truly believed in this as well, and they were involved in the process. So even though it was an increase in cost to them, they were on board with this. The childcare for staff was a concern at the beginning, but childcare is actually more equitable with our later start time, because our high school students, we have a large number of high school students who are providing childcare for younger siblings or getting them on the bus, which meant that they sacrificed being on time for school to get their younger siblings on. So now that all our schools start around the same time, all our kids have the opportunity to come to school at the same time, so they don't have to make a choice on that. The childcare for staff is actually working itself out because teachers can drop their kids off at school and still get to our school on time, and we end around the same time in the afternoon, so that works out. The traffic was the biggest issue that we actually didn't consider. It was something that after the first day of school, we realized that all 6 schools starting around the same time in a town that already has parking and traffic issues became a large problem, but we worked on that. We just changed where our buses drop off. Traffic is not perfect, it's never going to be, but I think we really worked together with the police. So if you are going to change your start time, that is one stakeholder you want to involve right from the beginning, because they can help with that. The outcomes of changing to a later start time, we actually have really good data on this. From the 2017-18, which is the last year that we had our 7:50 start, from then to the first year we implemented it, we had 28% fewer tardies. The following year, so we've been doing it for 2 years now, we have 37% fewer tardies now in the 2 years since we've implemented this from when we had the earlier start time. And I can also say anecdotally, our kids, whether they come to school on time or later, we used to call it the zombie walk. They would come in, they would look asleep. Literally like they rolled out of bed. Like Bert said, they would have their protein bars or their smoothies in their hand, and then they were sent off to school, and we expect them to learn. They still come in, but they're more awake. You can just tell. It's a completely different vibe in the morning than it used to be. And I will say students and faculty overwhelmingly like the start time. When we did this, we said we were going to reevaluate as we went through this, and we've given surveys, and our kids, actually, I think if I ever said we were going to an earlier start time again, there might be a revolt. And the faculty will even tell you they like it. We were worried about ourselves. I don't want to discount faculty members because we do put students first, but faculty members have families. So I think the big change was scary to them. How is this going to affect, my commute? How is this going to affect my childcare? How is this going to affect my time at home? And I can say for myself, I get 15 minutes more in the morning with my kids, which is the difference of me seeing them and not seeing them because of the time I leave. So it's actually been a very positive experience. And as an administrator with 1,600 kids in my building, this was one of the best decisions, if not the best decision I've ever been a part of for the health and well-being of kids. Okay. So the next slide, I'll go quickly through these technical versus adaptive changes because this is an adaptive change. This is one of those hard things to take on that we often say, yeah, we'll do that, but one day. We like the technical changes. We like things that are easy to handle, easy to get off our desk. We can solve them using our current processes, our current policies, our current procedures. I think the adaptive change, you need to gather people. You need to work together, use research, use data, communicate, reevaluate. You need to empower people. This cannot be a top-down change. You have to empower people to feel like it's their school. That includes kids, parents, board members, everyone. And this is truly a change in culture and mindset, and it takes time. That's why it took us 1.5 years to do. So I know people are saying, oh, can we do this for this September? I would actually advise against that because I think that's going to put you on the defense to defend the decision rather than involve people in a process that they truly believe in. I don't ever use the term buy-in. I use the term believe in because if people are involved, they understand the reasons for it and the benefits with it. So I'm going to read this. Technical problems reside in the head, and solving them requires an appeal to the mind, to logic, and to the intellect. Adaptive challenges lie in the stomach and the heart. And that's where I truly believe you have to think about what your district's values are, what your own values are, and that's what you need to lead with and constantly remind yourself and others what's important. And the health and safety of our kids is the most important thing. And I think if we keep that in our minds and we work together, we can do that. I also believe in our current situation that we are in remote learning, we're under quarantine. I think we did the impossible. Our teachers, at least in my district, had 2 days to go from teaching in person to online, and I think they're doing it pretty well. We're all going through a little bit of trauma right now, but it's also an opportunity, I think, to embrace new ways of doing things. We can do school differently. And one of the ways we can do school differently is to really look at our start times and why we're doing them. If we're doing them because of sports and transportation, I think we need to reprioritize. We know the research about what kids need as far as sleep. I can't think of a negative with the later start time. And I think it's important for us as parents and educators to advocate for kids right now and to really capitalize on this and to do better. It is a lot of work, but it's good work. And throughout this process, I've formed better relationships with people in my school and community, and they trust that I'm there for the kids, because this is not a decision for adults, it's a decision for kids. And let's go to the next one. The other one, this is actually my last slide before I turn it back over to Bert. This is a public health matter. This is a school issue, a community issue, a family issue, and I think we need to address it together. It's urgent. Our kids are not doing well. They're suffering from mental health issues. They're not getting enough sleep. They're not engaged in school. They need more sleep to address all the other issues. And I believe if that's one thing that we can change, it's one thing we should change. Like I said, I started off saying as a principal, my priority is health and wellness and safety. And we know more sleep is necessary. So later start time is something I truly believe in. And Bert, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. That was great. So before we get into advocacy, just to kind of circle back, because Jessica touched on so many of these important points, and I could see questions coming up in the Q&A and in the chat screen, and they're typically the same conversations that we have every time we talk about this. And so the idea is the science really supports that kids do better in any facet that you can measure when they sleep more. The difficulty is if we try to move school to a later start time, school ends at a later time, and there are the obstacles that Jessica mentioned. I think the first and foremost, the biggest obstacle is the transportation issue, because that is an economic issue and potentially a logistical issue. And then there's all the after-school activities. Sports, childcare are the big ones, and then there's every town has its own related issues. The importance of this, though, is just if you pause for a second, having a later school time of 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour is not mutually exclusive with not having sports and not having busing and not having all those other things. There are solutions to them, and each town is a little different. The transportation solutions are it's very important to have a transportation director who looks at this. You know, there are lots of different solutions, whether you decrease routes, which might cost more money, or you get more efficient, or you swap schools. So schools have done anywhere in between. Sports is the logistics of having sports is worked out, and it's worked out through, like Jessica said, some schools will have your last period as a rotating period. Some will have a kind of gym or a free period there. But again, as we prioritize the health and well-being and the performance, like I played sports growing up. I am not at all advocating not to have sports. We can have more effective sports where they are healthier and they succeed more. There was a school start time conference in Pennsylvania back in the fall, and some of the schools that moved to this were their ADs were saying this is their secret sauce. They wanted, a state championship because they slept later. Please don't let other schools do it because it'll remove their advantage. So we want all of this to be in place. What we're saying is the principle is that this is important to get together as a community. What is happening in California, the legislation passed there, and so it's going to be at a statewide level. And absolutely, it is easier if this is done in a larger geographic area, whether it is on a county level or a state level. It is just hard unless it's mandated. And what happens typically, what California wanted was they wanted it to be each individual community. New Jersey has a pilot study right now. There is no pending legislation to make this across the board, which means it's up to the individual towns, which means you have to advocate on your own, which is why I'm happy to see so many people listening to this talk. What we need, though, is now people to go and start talking to schools, talking to the principals and the superintendents and the boards. You go to board meetings and you start having these conversations. And again, you don't need the answers. You just need to remember there's not a school that gave up sports that moved to a later school start time. They all still have sports. They found a way to do it. And if there was ever a reason that we think we could do anything, if we look at the shakeup that COVID-19 gave to us as a community and how we handled it. So Jessica said it, within 2 days, we went to virtual learning across the state. Some schools were more prepared than others, but we all did it. And everyone is, they went into it, they're figuring it out. At a hospital level, never did we prioritize and say, we don't have enough vents, so we don't care about it. If patients come in, like, too bad on them. People thought about how to share a vent. Everyone built tents outside. We prioritized what was important and then said we're going to get the smartest people we could find across every different kind of group together to say, how do we solve this problem? And we want to tackle this issue in the same way. And initially, I think we were worried as a task force that potentially there's a lot of positive movement towards this nationally and statewide, that this COVID-19 might be a disruptor, but it might be a disruptor that we could tackle this in the setting of, as we're reconfiguring what schools should look like and we're thinking things through, we should be thinking that if we can get our kids more sleep, we will not only engage them more in school, but we will enhance their education, their mental health, and their physical health. So what do? Do your homework. It's there. All of this, we'll give you resources, but this is really straightforward. You'll have access to the slide presentation. Startschoollater.net is a resource that you could join. I think it's $25, and you'll have access to all of their information. It took Jessica and Princeton a year and a half to go through their process. My hope is that schools can build on the shoulders of people like Jessica. And so you have a process. I absolutely believe that you need to engage all the different participants so that the net result is something that was community built and worked for everyone. But the speed could be much faster, potentially. I don't think September, I would love to say September, but I think people building for September of 2021 to start, for this is great as you're rethinking what you're going to be doing now, everything you know about schools. So the process for change, this is just change theory in generally, as a generality. So educate the community, get all the stakeholders to the table, start talking with them, and it's everyone. It's parents and teachers, it's the school board, and it's the parents of sports people, it's the athletic directors. We have athletic directors from the NJSIAA as part of our task force because we know how important it is to engage them because sports is so important to us. Make sure you have forums where the public weighs in and they understand that this is not being done for any other reason other than the priority of science saying that we have to get them more sleep so that they are better. And as Jessica said, this doesn't just fall on the schools. Like, everyone has a role in this. Families need to remind themselves that sleep is important. People need to put their phones down at nighttime. They need to lead by example as adults. They need to get sleep for themselves. And we need to encourage our kids to understand the importance of sleep. So that takes us back to what has virtual learning taught us. And I think Jessica had talked about this, but that what we see now is that kids are sleeping more. And so, sometimes they're staying up later than we want them to, because I think not all parents are enforcing the kind of nighttime rules. But as they're sleeping more, they're reporting both in the office and to schools that they feel better. And Jess, I don't know if you have comments on that.
Well, I was just going to jump in. We did do a remote learning survey about 3 weeks into it with the high school students, and about 900 kids out of 1,600 answered. They do not like remote learning, as we know. They like seeing their teachers and friends. However, when asked their favorite parts of it, overwhelmingly, there were two things. One was that they actually really enjoyed time with their family, which I actually sent that out to parents so they could hear that and see that. But they kept saying overwhelmingly that I can sleep later. I'm getting enough sleep. I'm getting better sleep. And they also mentioned the part about sleep in that they weren't staying up to do homework. So they're staying up later because, I think everyone's our routines are messed up right now, but they are getting more sleep and they're enjoying it. So I think that's helping with the engagement with the remote learning. Because remember, being sleepy in school, you're not going to be engaged, you're not going to be learning. So it's not just about the health, it's also about, do we want our kids, we're sending them to school, we want them to learn. So let's give them the best possible situation to be able to do that effectively.
That's right. And, I think lots of families are also finding that they actually have time together. Sometimes too much time together, but at least, it's time together where they hadn't had it before. And it's time to, they're taking walks with their kids and talking about life where life was pretty busy for many families pre-COVID-19. And I think we're all getting a sense of, maybe that there's some happy medium. All right. So we have a task force. We're happy. Our task force is, I think, really well constituted, but we have members representing all the different contingencies. We're happy to have anyone else who is involved, curious, interested, be involved. Where the idea of our task force is to kind of bring information out about this and to kind of leverage the strengths of our members to help get the word out, because for the most part, this is going to be a grassroots effort to be done locally until we get it to the point where it's either being done at a statewide or a federal level, which, I don't think is going to happen in the imminent future, which means that every student who goes through high school, when schools start back up, is running. If their high school is starting early, they're not getting as much out of it as they could. Resources are here. And so everyone will have these. There's a ton. I don't know that there's some. Maybe COVID-19 is a topic that you could Google and get more research on. But if you want to Google school start times and evidence, there is so much research out there. We just collated the most important ones. And I think Brittany, do you have back control right now?
Yep, we should have control. So thank you so much, Dr. Mandelbaum and Ms. Baxter, for your presentation today. So once again, everyone, I realize that we're very close to 1 o'clock. We'll stay on for an extra 5 minutes or so. We do want to be respectful of your time. So if you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A box that's located at the top or bottom of your screen. We're not going to have time to get to everyone's question here today, but we will collect all of these. We'll share them with Jessica and with Dr. Mandelbaum, and we will get these responses back to all of you. But just to answer a couple of questions here live. Dr. Mandelbaum, this first question is for you. So we had somebody ask, if everything in the day is just moved an hour later, will students' circadian rhythms also shift? Will they end up just sleeping an hour later, but also staying up an hour later?
No, and so I think that's been answered through evidence. So their circadian rhythms will be what they'll be. We can align our schedule with them. So if we shift the day, ideally, they'll almost definitely sleep later, right? There's no reason for them to get up earlier, but their bedtime can be the same consistent bedtime if it's enforced through education, through their family. So again, there's evidence that has shown that in every district that has done it, they have seen the benefit of increased sleep time when they have shifted their school start times. And like Jessica saw, 30 minutes for 30 minutes, which again, would be great if it was 8 hours. But there's this philosophy of, if we're going to make change, do we make a huge change, which would be great, but any 20-minute increment or more, the kids will benefit from. So any benefit we could give to them, I would take.
That's great. Thanks, Dr. Mandelbaum. Jessica, this next question will be for you. We've actually received several questions just about everything around sports, right? So you answered some of this when you were speaking earlier, but can you share just a little bit more about how you coordinate processes for away games, for getting students to those?
Sure. Well, our home games all start at 4:15, so that gives us enough time to finish school, have the kids warm up, and start the game. But kids, if necessary, and as we did even before we went to later start time, sometimes for away games they need to leave school early, which is why we have a rotating schedule. So in the afternoon, instead of just always missing period 8, our athletes they might miss period 7, period 6, period 5. Or we have 2 days of our 6-day cycle that's unstructured time at the end of the day. So they're not missing a class period. And it goes the same for our coaches, because most of our coaches are teachers. So instead of finding substitutes to teach that last period of the class, they might not always be missing a class, they might be missing a prep period, but also the other kids who are not athletes are not losing their teacher for games. So we just got creative with that. We just work with other schools. Our athletic director, he's done a lot of work with this. It's a lot of relationship building with other schools to, say, we don't need an hour to warm up before a game. We maybe only need a half hour. So we just, it's gonna take a group effort. But sports are definitely an obstacle. But it's a problem that can be solved.
One other thing I think some schools did, and I think your athletic director had told me that when possible, sometimes the issue is you have a freshman team, a JV team, and a high school and a varsity team. And instead of playing the game serially on one field, there's been times where they've had, two different gymnasiums that can run basketball games simultaneously. They just needed an extra 2 refs, instead of delaying, they got there a little later, but were able to run games kind of in parallel, ultimately ending earlier than they were before.
Great, thank you both. We have one other question here that asks for your thoughts on how this might work with a regional high school that has multiple sending districts and therefore multiple transportation companies. Are either of you aware of any regional districts that have done this? And do you know if this was the case in California?
I'm not sure about California, Bert, maybe you can answer that, but we do have a sending district to our high school. The kids come there just for high school. They have a local district for K through 8, and we worked with them and involved them in this process. And like I said, it's a priority and a value of our district. So it was a big change for them, and it did increase costs for them, but it was the right decision for kids.
Yeah, and California, I do not believe has a carve out. Like I think they said it's 8:30 across the board. I think they allowed a little flexibility for middle schools, and I don't know if there's anyone on this call from the Freehold Regional District. I just know as a regional district, they're a 6 high school district. 3 schools start at 7:30, 3 schools start at 8:30. So I'm sure if there's different transportation companies, it's another level of difficulty, but none of it is an insurmountable obstacle. It just means it needs smart people to get at the table and say what our priorities are, and let's find a way to solve it.
Great, thanks. Now, Dr. Mandelbaum, this next question is for you. We had somebody ask, have there been any studies that look at the effect of sleep habits on the prevalence of students either starting or using drugs in high school?
I think in the last 5 years, there is an abundance of literature for schools that are starting to do this. So, schools that do it to measure the change to see the benefits. I haven't seen one that has looked at the measurable benefits of substance abuse. There's a ton of studies that look at the impact of lack of sleep on substance abuse. And so that less sleep leads you to more impulsive decisions, which leads to more substance abuse, of which also the common sense of unsupervised time. Again, a lot of, for high school sports, great, these kids are busy and after school. For the kids who are seniors, who are out of school, they're 17 or 18 and they're out of school at noon with nobody around. I couldn't think of a worse, kind of setup for them to not vape and not abuse substances. So I haven't seen specific literature. I just don't think we're that mature into our research yet, because there's just not enough school districts that have longevity to look at that particular benefit.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Mandelbaum. So in the interest of time, we'll pause with questions here, but like I said, we will get responses emailed out to you for all of these questions. So on behalf of the New Jersey chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. Before we sign off, I do want to also share that we're offering another webinar on this topic next Wednesday, May 13th. Dr. Catherine Dalsgaard is the clinical director of the Anxiety Behaviors Clinic and the Picky Eaters Clinic at CHOP. She's also a member of our task force on adolescent sleep and school start times. She's going to be presenting for us, and that webinar will be geared towards parents, community leaders, and school health advocates. We'll be sure to share the link for registering for this in our follow-up email after the webinar concludes. If you have any questions related to this topic or about our task force, please don't hesitate to reach out to our program director, Marcella Betzer, for additional information, and you can reach her either at the phone number or at the email address included on this screen. As we mentioned previously, CME and MOC Part 2 credits are being awarded for your participation in today's webinar. A webinar quiz will pop up in your browser when we conclude the webinar, and a link to the same quiz, like I said, will be emailed to you tomorrow if you're not able to complete it immediately following the webinar today. Once your quiz is submitted, your credits will be issued, and you can expect your certificate to be emailed to you over the next 30 days. And with that, we'll leave you all with this quote to reflect upon from Margaret Mead. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're wishing all of you a very safe and healthy spring, and this concludes our webinar. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.